Hello everyone, Phoenix Knight here. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a new playthrough on the channel. We're starting with our RPG debuts, and we're starting off in a pretty big way as we're debuting the Dragon Age tabletop role-playing game from Green Ronin Publishing. Now, admittedly I'm not very familiar with the Dragon Age world, so it'll be good to learn this, so I'll be learning this by immersion actually. Now you're probably wondering, Phoenix Knight, how do you play this game solo? Well, there are a couple tools I'm going to be using to help me out with that. The first one is actually going to be the Mythic Game Master Emulator. I've got all of my notes for that off shot. But the main thing I want to introduce is what's known as the fate chart. So if you remember when I've done Call of Cthulhu and Legacy of Cthulhu, both of those have a yes-no question-answer mechanic where I can ask essentially the game questions and start fleshing out my story to be like, okay, for instance, in Call of Cthulhu, we do something like, do we see anything out in town? Something like that. Answer it with a yes/no question. There are also modifiers, at least for Call of Cthulhu, where we could say, okay, if we think an answer is particularly likely or unlikely, we can modify it that way. So the fate chart actually modifies in two ways. The first I want to call attention to is the chaos rank, which will change with each scene, and that's how the game is measured when you're using Mythic Game Master Emulator. So after each scene, depending on whether or not we were in control of the scene, we'll adjust the chaos ranking accordingly. So if we weren't in control of a scene, we'll adjust it up. So the chaos ranking will go up. Whereas if we were in control of the scene, the chaos will go down. Let me just make sure I've got that straight. I believe when we adjust let me just double check that. Yes, if the scene was out of control, increase chaos by 1. Okay. And if we're not in control, we decrease it by 1. The other way we can potentially modify a question is on the odds. So everything defaults to 50-50 on chaos ranking 5. Whereas if we think a yes is particularly likely or unlikely, we can adjust based on the odds in either direction. And I'll see if I can hold it up here, but there are also some other numbers visible here, where you've got a lower range and an upper range. These are actually fifth values, which if you remember from Call of Cthulhu, we occasionally also can counter on fifth values. It's usually in the success direction, where we would have an extreme test, which is based on a fifth value. So for instance, on here, if we're testing at a 50, we'd need a 10 for an extreme success. The same kind of idea is going to apply here, but it'll apply in a little bit of a different way. So if we're at or under the value, then we get a yes answer to our question. If we're above it, we get a no. But if we score within the fifth on the lower side, we get what's known as an extraordinary yes. Similarly, if we're in the top range on the high side, we get an extraordinary no. As an example of how this would work, let's say in Legacy of Cthulhu, we encountered a car as we were exploring in Arkham. We come across the car and we want to ask Mythic. We want to ask our Game Master Emulator if the car will start, for instance. With Legacy of Cthulhu, it's just a yes/no, and we'd probably take that on 50-50. Whereas the yes is the car will start, no is the car won't start. But let's say we're on a 50-50, and we roll under a 10. It'll probably make more sense when we get into this. But let's say we put that same question to Mythic, and we roll at a 10 or under. We get what's known as extraordinary yes. So, actually it's exceptional technically, but what we get there is something to the effect of not only does the car start, but it's got a full tank of gas. So we get an extra bonus to that almost. Whereas if we roll in the 91 or above, then we get an exceptional no. So something to the effect of, okay, if we try to start the car blows up, that kind of thing. So it's basically like an exceptional no, or maybe we even find that the door's locked, or the fuel tank's ruptured. A lot of this, when you're doing solo RPGs, is subject to interpretation based on your logical situation. So you do need to be mindful of that. The other tool I'm going to be using is actually from the Solo Adventures Toolbox, which is available on DriveThruRPG by Paul Bimler, as is Mythic Game Master Emulator. I'm going to be using some random tables from there, but I'm also going to be using what's known as the 60-12 system. This will help me flesh out an area quickly. So I've got 60-12s I've got 60-12s over here, which I'll play Vanna White once more, so you can see I've got 60-12s in different colors. Each one of those on the 60-12 system corresponds to a different element of the map. So one is monsters, another's clues, another one is environment features, and so on. So those are the two tools I'll be using here. Anyway, I think that's enough on the introduction, so let's get into our first scene. We'll be dividing this by scenes. Right now our chaos factor starts at 5. So the first thing we need to roll is for if the scene is going to play out according to our control. If the value is lower, then the scene gets modified in some way. Whereas if it's higher, the scene plays out. And the scene I'm visualizing for this scenario, I want to keep the scenario small. So the scene I'm envisioning here is our arrival in town. And with a chaos factor of 5, we have to ask, does the scene play out as we expect it to? That is a 1, so no, it won't play out as expected, but it will be altered, which is different from an interrupted scene where something else happens. So that's a 1, which means we're interrupted. So now, no, it's altered. So something's different about the scene that I've got in mind. So I should probably introduce the character that we're playing for this once I find what I did with her. So you may remember that I was rolling up a character's backstory in Call to Adventure. So we are playing, it might be a little bit hard to see everything in pencil, but we are playing Adana Brightmage. We're playing as our Circle Mage, our Elven Circle Mage that we rolled our backstory for in Call to Adventure. So that's her main side, that's her first side of her stats. We have different focus elements. We have our different skills: communication, constitution, cunning, dexterity, magic, perception, strength, and willpower. Most of those are pretty self-explanatory, I would imagine. We've got a gauntlet for brawling and a quarterstaff for melee weapons. In addition, we've got an arcane lance that's got a range of 16 yards. And then on the back, we started her off with, we've got her with 63 gold pieces and very basic traveler equipment. So that's going to be our character that we're playing for this scene. So now we venture into town. So we're arriving in the town of, I wish there was there's supposed to be a map in here, isn't there? Yes, there is a map. Let me get this torn out. So we are in Ferelden. I may end up putting this map up. We are arriving in the town of Amaranthine on the coastlands, fresh from a ship. I don't know which map. So we've got a Ferelden map. So just to show you where we're at, we are in this coastal town of Amaranthine up here. Might be a little bit hard to see with the map here, but that's where we're starting the scene. Or this scenario, I should say. So arriving in Amaranthine. And I was hoping there would be an explanation of what the town is like in here, but we are looking at a temperate and fertile country, but we need to be aware of winters. We are coming here in the late fall for this one. Coastal town, so very much a fishing community that we'd expect. Walking through the town, we see very typical fantasy town. So it's got your typical tavern. It's got a brawlers guild, which is a little bit weird. It's a very bustling port city, as we evidenced from stepping off the port. So we're exploring the town. There's definitely a lot of sea life around here. fishing business is obviously bustling around here. But the reason that we're here is we have actually been summoned by a mage trainer because we've been summoned by a mage trainer as we're looking for, as our background is we're actually looking for forbidden magical knowledge. So our knowledge is actually going to start with very mundane magical knowledge, as we've been summoned by a mage trainer here. So our first stop will actually be in the tavern. So I'm arriving at Amaranthine. And I need to find some way that the scene gets interrupted. Actually, let me go back to my notes on Mythic. So, right, so I have to remember that we got interrupted on the scene. So I think the first question that I want to put to... So the first question I want to put here is, as we're in the tavern, do we see anybody acting weird do we see anybody acting funny in the tavern? We'll call that let's call that a 50-50 on this one. So once again, we're at a cast rank of 5 right now. We're looking at 50-50, so we're going to be rolling on that. If we're at or below 50, then somebody's acting weird. If we're above 50, then nothing out of the ordinary happens. That's a 27, so somebody is acting funny. So tavern, suspicious, yes. So let's go. So I'm actually going to go to the Solo Adventurers toolbox because I want to use the keyword table in there to get ideas of what might be happening in here. Of course, I need to make this huge binder of paper turn over for me because I'm trying to get to the keywords table. So we're looking at a D8 and a D100. So I got my D100 right here, and I'll grab one of my dice sets since I have a few right here. I need one. Okay, there we go. I needed one that's got a D8 in it. The D8 is actually going to be my hundreds die, tens, ones. So let's roll up some keywords. Maybe we can get some ideas on what we see in this tavern. Let's see, that's a 409. Help if I had my pen, which is back over here. 409, slave. That's a 591. Slave skill. What do I want to do with slave skill? And we'll take one more. 490. Slave skill spoiled. So maybe we see an aristocrat slave acting, I'm thinking what I want to do with that. Slave skill spoiled. Maybe the slave is refusing to obey the command of his master. I guess slavery is also a thing in Amaranthine. Actually, that's a question I should put to the Oracle, to the Mythic. So given that we've got keyword slave, is slavery a thing here? And I'm going to call that, let's go with a 50-50 roll on that. Because I'm not sure I want to run with slave as a keyword, but skill and spoiled could be something. You know what? Maybe I don't need to wonder if slavery is a thing, because there are ways around that. But let's roll anyway. Maybe it's a scene setting detail. 95, no, slavery is not a thing. Actually, that's That's an exceptional no. That's an exceptional no, to the point where anything that could be construed as slavery is frowned on here. Slavery like. So even something like indentured servitude would be frowned on, like you're trying to pay a debt. So I'm actually going to roll another keyword instead of slave. See if I can get something else here. $247. Let's see, 247, craft. Okay. So instead of slave, maybe we see a craftsman who's got exceptional skill. So a craftsman with exceptional skill. But this actually, is this a... So yeah, we'll call it a craftsman with an exceptional skill, but acting... We'll call it acting like a spoiled brat. Although that's not necessarily out of the ordinary with the tavern keeper. So probably par for the course, I would say, with a... Question is, what kind of skill does the craftsman have? I don't think the keyword table is going to give me much on that. But, maybe it's somebody crafting shoes or something for the fisherman. He's acting the fool, basically, is kind of what we're getting into there. So the question is, do we go over to him? I'm going to honestly say no. Adana's not going to go near that. She'll sit down and get a quick drink just to kind of settle her nerves a little bit. So quick drink. Next, does anything else out of the ordinary happen in the tavern? There's probably something else going on here. So let's take this as we'll roll this as a somewhat likely. That's a 68, so no, nothing else happening here. So we'll just make a note of the craftsman that's acting like a spoiled brat with the shoes. So nothing else happening here. Adana will enjoy her drink, and then she'll depart from the tavern to see what... She'll depart the tavern, and we'll head off to find this mage trainer that we've been summoned to. So I guess the question I want to put to Mythic now is our mage trainer actually in town? We'll call that a 50-50 since it's pretty bustling here. Actually, maybe that's the interruption. So we go searching for the mage trainer that summoned us here, except we can't find the mage trainer. I think that's because that would be the way I'd expect to... Because that's the way I'd expect to have the scene go out. So maybe that's the interruption. Can't find the trainer. So I think that sends us back to the tavern with the next question of... So we go back to tavern. Maybe we'll order another drink. But now we want to ask the tavern keeper if he knows anything about a mage trainer. And given that this is a tavern keeper, and this tavern seems to be like the center of activity, I'm going to call this a very likely. I'm going to call it a very likely. So we're looking here at a chaos ranking of 5. 85 and lower, the tavern keeper knows something. 16 would be considered an exceptional yes. 97 would be an exceptional no. That's a 95, which turns out that the Tavern Keeper actually doesn't know much of anything, which is a surprise. I guess the mage trainer must be a bit of a recluse in his or her area of expertise and doesn't know anything. Now the question is, do we overhear anything? Let's roll our first skill test, actually. So we're going to roll a communications check to see if we hear anything, else in the tavern. So that's a 3d6 plus an ability plus a focus. I'm going to call this... So the way we roll skill test in Dragon Age is we've got 3d6 plus a modifier on our character sheet. 2 dice are the same color. 1 is a different color. That's known as the dragon die. That one, I believe... There was something in here that was explaining skill tests. But that dragon die can potentially have impact on our successes. So figure out the test result. Actually, that's a question I want to put. That's a question I should put. Is everything fairly loud? Is it loud in here? Let's call it a likely, because the tavern is fairly loud, because it's a tavern. And the reason I want to put this question here is because I want to determine I'm using it to determine the difficulty of the test that the check I want to make a communications roll on. That's a 14, so I called it a likely. 14 on a likely, that's an extreme success, so that's an exceptional yes, so it is very loud here. Which means I'm going to have to make this a fairly difficult roll. So I'm going to call this we're going to call this a hard communication roll. Which means we have to pass a difficulty check of a 15. And we only get to add 1 to this. So I'll make our roll here in just a second. Let me get the percentile dice out of shot. That's a 13, plus 1 is 14, but that's going to be lower than the difficulty check, so we actually don't hear anything. So essentially we can't hear over the din of we can't hear over the noise of the tavern. So say we depart the tavern, like maybe Adana's getting a headache at this point. She's getting kind of frustrated with the tavern. So she leaves, and now she's going to leaves the tavern again. And now we'll ask around town if we can find anybody. So we'll roll we'll roll on the fate chart, and we'll see if Adana can find anybody that knows anything about this mage trainer. Asks around town. Does anyone know anything about a mage trainer? And given that this is a port town with all kinds of people, we'll call this a very likely. So I'll roll this as another very likely. That is 79, so that will be a yes. Somebody does know something. The question is, who knows something? So let's get an NPC table. At least I think there's an NPC table in here, isn't there? Let's see. Boon, Bane, item, keywords. 100 skill challenges. Villain, big bad. Appendix, which is an example playthrough. That's not what I want here. Random quest name. Random relic name. That's not what I want either. Monster tactics. Blast it all. There's not an NPC table in here. That's actually kind of annoying. Excuse me. Okay, so we'll call it, so we'll say, so I guess the question now is, so we find something. Question is, what do we find and how do we find it? So let's go to the keywords table to see if we can get an idea of how we find anything. So that'll send us back to the keywords table. We'll grab our D8 and our D100. $286. Let's see, 286 communion. Seems like somebody at a cathedral maybe knows something. Because communion, that's my first thought, is going to church. 179. Medicine. $366. Friend. Okay, so an apothecary coming out. So maybe we run into an apothecary. So we run into an apothecary coming out of a cathedral. We run into an apothecary coming out of a cathedral who turns out to actually be friends with this mage trainer. Turns out to be friends with this mage trainer. With a mage trainer, anyway. So we show this apothecary the note. And we were told to come here. Now the question is, are we looking for the same trainer? So we were told to come here with the same note. We were told to come here by the note. We show him the note. Is it the same trainer? I'm going to call it... do I want to call it a... I'm going to call it a has to be. Because at this point, all the pieces are there. So we're rolling on the fate chart once again. That's a 92, which on a has to be is just barely a yes. But it turns out that it is our mage trainer. So now we've met two... Where are my notes on Mythic? Here we go. So we've got an apothecary that I'll flesh out. And our mage trainer. So it turns out the apothecary knows that the mage trainer is actually at some kind of tower on the edge of town. We need to... The trainer does come into town quite often, but... The trainer does come into town quite often, but he normally bases at that mage tower outside of town. So we figure it's been a long day. We thank the apothecary for his information and go on our merry way. So we go over to the inn. Next question I want to ask Mythic is, are there rooms available? We'll call this a 50-50 because it's not a sure thing that there's going to be a room available. This is a bustling town. That's a 14, which is a yes. There are rooms available and the rates are very reasonable. Rate would be, let's call it 20 silver pieces for a night. Adana will pay the 20 silver once I find my character sheet over here. So she's down... Ooh. Actually, that might hit her a little bit. Let's call it 80 copper pieces instead. So 62 and 20 copper pieces. I realized 20 silver was actually pretty high. So we'll do 80 copper instead. So we'll thank the innkeeper, immediately go to bed, and collapse for the night. And that's the end of scene 1, which will actually bring our chaos factor now up to 6. But I'm going to make a quick journal entry on that because I still do like the journaling aspect of these solo RPGs. So I'll put the stream as usual into Be Right Back, but I will be around to interact with chat as I go through journaling this. Let me just check my phone real quick here. Okay, timers are running just fine. I'm trying to keep going with laundry, but we are ready to have our first journal entry, so I'll come back in-game for this one. Pull up my notes and notepad. So journal entry number 1, arriving in Amaranthine. I arrived in the port town, this is written from Adonna's perspective. I arrived in the port town of Amaranthine holding a note that a mage trainer had heard about my quest for forbidden magic and wanted to train me. I made a couple of stops at the local tavern, but I couldn't find anything. The only thing of note was a craftsman of exceptional skill with making shoes who was kind of a prick. After seeing him there, I left the tavern again but couldn't hear anything after a tour of town didn't yield any information. Later, I was able to find something from a friendly apothecary who was just coming out of church services. It turned out this apothecary was friends with the mage trainer that had summoned me to Amaranthine. The mage trainer who had summoned me here lives in a tower just outside the city, but comes into town frequently. Thanking him for the information, I headed to the inn to see if there were any rooms available. There were, and the rates were reasonable. Thanking him, I paid for a room and immediately collapsed for the night. Entry 2 is going to revolve around going to look for this mage trainer. So scene 2. Looking for mage trainer outside Amaranthine. So I don't know if we're going to do anything with that craftsman in the... Doesn't seem likely with the tavern. That apothecary may be worth coming back to. So we may come back to that. Do I want to do one more scene here? Hold on just a second. Okay, just got some notifications there. Nothing going on there. I think... I kind of wanted this to be more a test of Mythic than anything. So we'll come back to scene 2 later, as we're going to look for the Mage Tower. So I've made notes of everything to be able to pick this up later. We'll come back to that later this month. Actually, do we want to try one more scene here? It's 3:30 and I just saw my timer for my laundry. So I think we're actually going to take a break. We may come back a little bit later to do another scene or two in Dragon Age. So we'll put a pin in here for now, and we might come back to this later. We're at scene 2, we'll be searching for the Mage Tower. I'll talk more about what's coming up on the channel after we come back to this. But thank you for watching this video. Please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to turn on notifications so you get my content. Be well, stay safe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and I'll be back with more videos in the future. Until then, take care everyone.